On MPTV Property Panel tonight, we're discussing, is property a better option than superannuation or share investment? Tim Fletcher from Fletcher's Real Estate, welcome.
Thank you.
From Empower Wealth, Ben Kingsley. Ben, it's obviously a big topic, but...
Simple question, not an easy answer.
No, especially with all the talk of politicians messing with our superannuation. What are your thoughts, though, property versus shares and superannuation?
Yeah, look, I don't have a view around, property being better than shares. My view is around what I, as an investment advisor and an analyst, I'm looking at what I can make money for my clients. Now, in terms of property, there's a few things that I like about property that I don't like about the share market. So I'm not saying I don't advocate for shares. I'm not qualified to talk about shares. But in terms of property, what I do like about it is it allows for control and influence. So when you buy a property, you own it outright. So you can implement things into it, improvements, and you can better manage the outcome of that investment. I also like the fact that it's basically less volatile. So when you've got a situation where you've got sentiment in the market changing, people still have to live somewhere in residential property, whereas in the share market we can all panic and take the money out quickly. So it's obviously property is a lot more illiquid than liquid, whereas the share market's very liquid. So we see these big changes in values really soon. I mean, over the long term, you'll see a lot of commentators and analysts say you're getting, very similar returns. But I say the same thing. You're not buying the entire property market, and unless you're buying the index in the share market, you're not actually buying all the shares. So I think there's a conversation around what's more appropriate to you, what's more appropriate to your risk tolerances. And then when we talk about superannuation, superannuation is effectively a forced saving scheme. Now, being a forced saving scheme, the government's basically said that we don't trust you with your own money and we realise we're going to run out of money, so we're going to basically commit some money for your retirement or your future, because once you stop working, someone needs to support you. So it's basically a tax structure. Now, I don't, again, sort of advocate whether superannuation is better than buying direct property. What I actually advocate in this space is a combination of the two is really good. I mean, we have to have super. So whether you have a self-managed super fund or whether you have to have an industry fund or a retail fund, and in terms of investing outside of your super, well, it's very evident that super in its own right is not going to be enough to sustain the quality of life and the living standards of what people are looking for.
Tim, your thoughts? Obviously, I presume property would be what you're favouring.
Yes and no to that. I think a well-balanced super fund actually has, if you're able to, property in it. But you see a lot of people haven't got that luxury because they haven't got enough money in to have a mix of other investments. Some of them may be shares, it might be gold, it might be whatever it be, and property as well. So that becomes a bit of a problem for some people unless there's enough money in the fund. But if you've got the luxury of having enough money in the fund, yes, I think property is a very important part of that superannuation fund. However, I think when people do this, they need to be mindful of the fact they're not buying their own home. And that's why people like Ben's organisation are very good to be able to source properties that are appropriate for your needs. And what I'm saying here, basically in a nutshell, is that you want something that's low maintenance, you want something that you're getting a good yield on, and you want reasonably capital growth. Now, some people buy property without regard to superannuation. They're looking for long-term growth, and the rental returns probably very minimal. And, properties basically aren't designed to be built and occupied for return. Most homes give people very good capital growth over a period of time. And if it's your own, we know you don't pay tax on it, and let's hope that stays forever. But when you've got an investment property, it's a different kettle of fish. So people need to look very carefully at what they're doing when they're buying property for other than their own principal place of residence.
And Ben, obviously there is that option in your superannuation. Doesn't have to be one or the other. What sort of level are you looking at where you've got the superannuation that you should start looking at property in a self-managed fund?
Look, there's an inquiry happening at the moment in the federal government to talk about whether they actually set a benchmark minimum. At the moment, it's loosely framed around $200,000, but once you actually acquire a property inside a self-managed super fund, that might make the fund be worth $400,000 or $450,000. So the difference between having money in an industry fund or a retail fund versus in a self-managed super fund is inside a self-managed super fund, effectively there's an ability to gear, to leverage an investment. So that's what's made self-managed super funds and property all the flavour at the moment, because people are able to accelerate the wealth base that they've got in their self-managed super fund.
And people see it and say, well, I've got 150 grand, I buy a $500,000 apartment, suddenly my super's worth 600,000. What is the downside in there? What are the pitfalls for people?
Look, there's real big pitfalls. The first one is there's a lot of people promoting property as a great investment vehicle through super. Now, they're not qualified to technically do that, so you wouldn't want to be having a sale agent basically promoting property as a great investment when they're really got a vested interest in you buying that particular property. So the first one is to obviously seek and get independent advice around taking that step. Now, in terms of how the lending structured around a self-managed super fund, effectively there's a non-recourse loan structure in place. So the super fund's not actually borrowing the money. There's usually what we call a bear trust that's set up that's acting on behalf of that to leverage the investment to get in there. So the pitfalls are it's a lot more complicated. There are a lot more costs associated with it. So you've got to make sure that returns outweigh the cost base associated with that. And secondly, it's quite restrictive in terms of can you multiply, i.e. can you release the equity out of that property and go again? And the answer to that right now is no, you can't. So, going back to earlier points, I think diversifying with some properties in a portfolio outside in your personal name and also inside may be the right way to go, but certainly seek professional advice.
Tim, are you finding more and more people tell your agents and yourself that they're buying for their super fund? And if so, what are they buying?
Well, they're certainly buying, there's more of them buying in that capacity, certainly, in the areas we're predominantly in. You haven't got these large